We started out in this course doing sequentially structured programs in which we would get input from the user, perform some process on that input, and display output. And I said it's easy to think of every programming challenge as being an input, process, output flow. Then a few weeks ago we added in decision structures or conditional structures, in which now we have a situation in the flow of the program where we're asking a question. And that question is either true or false. That's a Boolean expression or Boolean question. If it's true, we're going to do something. If it's false, we're going to do something else. And we saw that there are multiple types of decision structures or conditional structures in Visual Basic. The simplest is the if-then structure, in which we're going to do something if a condition is true. The second one we looked at was the if-then-else, in which we do one thing if the condition is true, but something else if it's false. A third type was the if-then-else-if-else. And here we have multiple conditions we can evaluate. Once one condition is true, everything else is ignored. So if condition A is true, it will do something based on the truth of that condition A. But if not, it's going to evaluate, in this case, condition B. And if condition B is true, it'll do something. And if that's not true, so both of those are false, we do something else. That's the else clause. And we also saw we could have as many else-if forks as we need. So I'm not limited just to condition A and condition B. I can have condition C, condition D, and so forth. And then we had a select case structure in Visual Basic. In other languages, might be referred to as a switch structure, in which we have a container, and we're going to try to match the value of that container with different cases or different forks. So in our first case, if value A matches the value of the container, and the container is usually a variable, we're going to do something if that's a match. If not, we'll see if value B is a match. And if value B is a match, we'll do something else. And we can have as many cases as we need there, so we have as many else-if forks as we need. And then there's a case else that will do something if there are no matches. And by now, you should have a pretty good feel for those different conditional structures. Now we're going to introduce another structure, and that's called a repetition structure, often referred to as a loop. And it looks very similar to the decision structure, but look at the arrows. In our condition, if something is true, we're going to execute some code, and then we're going to loop back up above that condition and check to see that condition is still true. This is called a do-while conditional repetition structure. So while that condition is true, we're going to keep doing the process that's represented in the green rectangle here. Now, just as we had multiple types of decision structures or conditional structures, we also have multiple types of repetition structures. There are two broad categories. One is fixed iterative repetition structures, in which we could actually look at our code and look at the values, and we would know how many times that code is going to execute. It's sort of like in the game of hide and seek, you're going to count from 1 to 100. You're going to repeat that process of counting 100 times. You have a beginning and an ending value that you're going to follow and incrementing each time through. That's our first fixed iterative loop, which is a for next loop. Another fixed iterative is looking at a collection and is going through each item in the collection and doing something. So there the repetition is it's simply going to the next item each time until it gets to the end. There's no more items left. If we know how many items there are in the collection, we know how many times that loop is going to run. Then there's the conditional repetition structure. And in a conditional repetition structure, there is a Boolean expression. That's why we call it conditional. There are 4 types in Visual Basic, and in most languages there's only 2, but we have 4 in Visual Basic. We could get by with just 2 of them, and I'll explain that in a minute. So our first one is a do-while, in which we have a condition, and if that's true, or while that condition remains true, we're going to keep executing the process to be performed. Now it has a corollary, which is the do until. It works the exact same way, but it repeats the code as long as the Boolean expression is false. It's going to do it until it becomes true. Now in both of those cases, we're evaluating the expression first before we perform the process, and that process may not execute at all if the condition is false in the do while or if the condition is true in the do until. But sometimes we want to start a process and perform it once regardless of what the Boolean condition is. And here we have do loops. So we have a do loop while in which we perform the process and then we check to see the condition. And as long as the condition is true, we'll keep going back and repeating that process. Same with the do loop until. We'll do the process, and as long as that condition is false, we'll keep repeating that process until the condition becomes true. This is called a post-test evaluation. So in the do loop while, we're looking at a true post-test, and in a do loop until, we're looking at a false post-test. Whereas the do while and the do until structures are a pre-test. We test the condition before we ever execute the code of the process to be performed. Now I said you can get by with only two of them. The reality is you don't necessarily need the do until or do loop until, and most languages don't have those. We get away from that by using a not operator, so we can say do while not the Boolean expression, and that equates to the do until. Or we can say do loop while not the Boolean expression for the do loop while, and that equates to effectively being the do loop until. But Visual Basic gives you all 6 of these opportunities, and so we'll look at each one in a little more depth in the next videos. The choice of which repetition structure to use really depends on the task at hand, but also on the programmer's choice and their preference. In many cases, we can use either a fixed iterative or a conditional repetition structure, depending on how we write the condition. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Programming Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create, you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.